Now, people often ask me, what's it like to work at Thoughtworks? I joined about 18 months ago after a long career in various things in corporate life. I'm a late joiner. And I think when you meet the next two people who will present today, you're going to get a really good idea of what it's like to work at Thoughtworks. And it's just the most remarkable place because of the people that are there. They're fascinating, they're smart, they are multidisciplinary, they lead all sorts of things out in the tech community as well as doing their day jobs. They're committed to the clients and are just such hard workers and great thought leaders. And I'm so pleased to have Harmeet and Kiru here today, both of whom I've had the pleasure of relying on in one way or another in my work channels to find out complex answers to complex questions. And they're here today to talk about something they're passionate about good design and security going hand in hand, not being enemies at all. And so I commend to you, listen closely, get involved on the chat channel if you've got any questions for them. It's a relaxed pace of talk, but put your questions up and we'll chat with them afterwards. So I'm going to hand over to you two, team. I will stop sharing and then the screen is all yours. Kiru or Harmeet, who's kicking off?
I will be sharing.
We're in good hands then. I hand over.
Thanks, Nigel. Yeah, we're just sorting out sharing things. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Harmeet. So today, Kiru and I will share our experiences of building a secure data platform. So let's start with a poll. Soon, Kiru will be initiating a poll. Our poll is, let's see what our audiences think about the average cost of per data breach in Australia. Okay, let's launch the poll. So is it 1 million? Is it between 1 to 3 million? Or do you think it's 3 to 5 million or maybe more than 10 million? So we have results coming in. Oh, it's going on. So yeah, I see that most of you have already participated. So we'll end the poll and see what the results are. Yes, so that's interesting. Most of you think that it's between 3 to 5 million. And some of you do think that it's between 1 to 3 million. So now time to see the actual results. Yeah, so the average cost of, as per one of the research, average cost of data breach in Australia is around 3.35 million per breach. And it is increasing by 9.8% year on year. One of the key reasons it is increasing is that organizations have started realizing the value of data. And when we think about realizing the value of data, we start collecting more and more data so that we can build variety of data products. And when we talk about data products, we think about data platform. Now, data platform has 5 key components or maybe phases. It starts with onboarding. Now, what does onboarding mean? Onboarding is the process of understanding your data, what kind of data we are going to use, who would be responsible for the quality of data, who would be responsible for the data that is coming in, who knows about that data, and how to give access, create a location for that data. So that's onboarding. Once we do that, we ingest the data and we store the data, that's storage. And then we may process the data to create more curated data or sort of data products, which can be consumed by the organization, and that we call as consumption. When we think about the security part of the data platform, we need to think about all these aspects. It starts from onboarding and goes till consumption. Apart from this, Apart from this, it's also important to think about your motivation. Is it regulation? Is it reputation? Or is it some type of intellectual property that you want to secure? Along with this, there are three key principles of security: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which we should also consider when designing for security. Now, as there are so many aspects, we always get a question, where should we start? So let's look at a stat. As per one of the research, one of the top categories of compromised records in data breach is customer PII data. And with this, it's clearly evident that we need to identify our data and classify this. And we should use this classification to understand who can access what type of classification. And once that is done, we need to discuss and decide what needs to be done to protect each type of classification. And this is not a one-time process. We should make this whole process a part of entire data platform development lifecycle. And there are certain security foundations which, irrespective of your objectives, are important and to be implemented. And classification, data classification, can not only help you identify, figure out these foundational aspects of security, but can also help you enhance it based on your security objective. So now, as we are talking about classification, the question comes to what level of classifications we should use. Or the other question may be how to start with classification. So our recommendation is always start simple. Now you see 4 classifications on your screen. You can simply start with those classification, like highly sensitive, which can be your SSN number or payment card information. Confidential can be your M&A evaluation or maybe your sales plan. Private is something like your product information or your campaign information. And public are any sort of public releases. And you can simply start with 2 as well, PII and non-PII. And the other question comes to that when should we classify? So best place to start classification is when you're onboarding the data. Don't wait for the data to get into platform and start thinking about classification. The other key aspect is the categories. Yes, we should do field level or column level classification, which is absolutely critical, but document level classification is also important. One of the important aspect or use of documented level classification is when your infrastructure is not ready to support or it's not up to date to support column level or field level access management, you can use document level classification to strengthen your security.
So like Hamid was saying, so let's assume that you know your categories and you're there to classify the information. The next question comes like, where do we capture that information? And one of the things that we have seen work really well is to start defining a data contract. So if you're someone from a developer background, you'll be very familiar with defining contract between the APIs. Or if you're someone from the data background, you'll be very familiar with the contracts, in the event world. So it's kind of very similar to that, which is a standard format across your organization. And other thing to start understanding is like who owns the data. So this is not from the data platform perspective, but rather from the the product perspective. So who is the actual owner? They are the ones who would know more about the life cycle of the data, and as well as like what regulatory requirements are there. So if there are specific requirements around GDPR regulations or locally here in Australia, consumer data protection. So they are the ones who know the best about the data. And as well, start thinking about the schema. How do we kind of capture them? And also we'll share more examples, as we go in how we can start using the contract throughout the life cycle of your data platform. And as we'll have a think about registry. So like kind of the governance around it need not be really heavyweight when you start on day one. It could be, as simple as taking the contract and chucking it into your existing code repository and, evolve from there. And you might also notice towards the top right corner, there are a few icons. So the first one is obvious, kind of indicates which phase of the data platform you're talking about. And the second icon kind of gives you an idea, like which principle does this concept help with. So in this case, it kind of helps with integrity. On other cases, it will be around confidentiality or availability. So from the practical perspective, that should give you an idea of why we are recommending these. Okay, let's take a look at an example of the contract. Like the format is not very particular. You can go with whatever you're using already. It could be Avro, YAML, or JSON. And what you're seeing here is a YAML. It's like a couple of key value pairs. And to highlight some of the fields which are particularly important here is to start capturing the owner. And when we say owner, it should be an attribute which is a contact information about the team. It could be an email address, or it could be a Slack channel, whichever you're already using. And format of the data. Again, the data owner is the one who will know more about where the particular data would be used, how are you going to analyze, and then come up with the appropriate format. And like Hamid was saying, capture the classification here. Also, another important thing is like, try if you can capture the reasoning behind the classification, because that really helps the team to understand the rationale behind certain access levels and decisions. And it will make it easier for them to see if they can actually do things differently. So the key things to note, like make it standardized and don't worry about getting it perfect on day one. Important to see how you can make it extendable, and also don't make it like very tightly coupled with your existing ecosystem. And for this talk, we are kind of going to assume that the very basic, fundamental security around the cloud are already in place. So things like you have set up AD, ability to use single sign-on, and MFA within your organization. And when it comes to set up on your cloud, you have like VPCs and subnets, and you know how to manage your security policies and groups. So we won't go into the details of it, but kind of extending from here. So your current setup might look something like this. So a couple of private subnets. And when you start thinking about your data platform, so you'll be storing data, say in the AWS world, it's in S3 buckets. And you could see how you can extend this particular architecture. And when you have the classification of data, you can create a private subnet just for that particular category and define a VPC endpoint and store the data with access only from this particular subnet. So you can see if someone from this subnet is trying to access some other data, you can kind of manage it with your endpoint policies, have monitoring around it, and have alerts around it. And similarly, if somebody else within your organization is trying to access this sensitive data, you can control it with your bucket policies. So you can see that you start building those layers of defense here, even at the infrastructure level. So what else? Sorry. What else can you do, like when you have a contract, when you're onboarding? So you have published your contract, and based on the information within the contract, you can actually start determining, where the data would be stored within the platform automatically. Say in this example, so if it's like a landing loan customer, so based on the topic information, you automatically determine where the data would land. And as well, you might be using some service to do it on a regular basis. So some kind of an ingestion service, and leverage your existing, AD systems within your organization. So something like an Okta or Microsoft AD. So leverage that and set up roles there, which will actually determine the access for this service to that particular path. And then the service could ingest the data. What you're starting to build here is an ability to actually track who ingested data onto the platform, and as well as an ability to kind of trace and monitor and alert. And in majority of the cases, what we have seen is that when you start building a platform, it becomes a bit of a data dump initially if you don't have these in place. And it's like a lot more easier, minimal effort to set up. So very quickly, so now you would have an idea how you can define a contract, make it simple on day one, and how you could leverage that even before you start ingesting your data to determine where the data goes and who can actually ingest the data. So move on to the next phase. So you have your onboarding, you have a classification, and then you start ingesting your data. So if we go back to the architecture that we had, you can actually start extending it and start creating zones when you start ingesting data. So ideally speaking, when the data is highly sensitive, the data should be like encrypted or obfuscated in some way. And ideally the data owner is the one who would do it. But in most cases, we see, that's not the case yet. So when the data lands in the platform, you can create two different zones like landing and encrypted, and have different levels of controls, between these two zones. And how here in this example, you can see how we can extend this and manage the controls at a fine grained level. So any code, anything from the pipeline automated by default will have access only to the encrypted data. And it's only a small subset of privileged people who will have access to the raw, highly sensitive data. And so when it comes to ingestion, again, there's a question around how do I encrypt and what do I do? Again, data owner plays a key role who will help understanding the frequency of usage and the protection levels. So if it's like not frequently used, go with simple masking or hashing. Frequently used, go with minimization. And high level of protection, encryption. And if it's more frequently used, then go with tokenization. And again, within those models, it need not be like one solution that would fit everything. So it need not be very complex when you start with on day one. So if you're working with an existing system which has a constraint around the format and the length, then go with the format preserving encryption methods. And if it's like very highly sensitive, then go with a tokenization. And again, if there is a requirement to store the data within a geography or within a country, then go with vaultless tokenization. And this would also kind of minimize the risk of ability to decrypt. And even for data that you're using in a dev or a test environment, like go with simple like masking. And also, you might have heard about an ability to kind of randomly seed noise into a data set. And that is like very commonly used in a medical research. And I also personally hope that that is used, that is applied before, we hear all this analysis around the lockdown data now. Okay, so during the ingestion and storage, the other part is like, okay, the services ingesting data into the platform, and it is stored somewhere within the platform. I guess probably from our experiences, this is one of the most understood phase because maybe we have been using it in the form of databases for a long time. So immutability, how do you do versioning? How do you do deletion? And managing the retention? What's the life cycle of the data? Here again, you can go back to the contract and add attributes. The data owner would define, how long should this data be, stored and retained. And again, policies around like backup and replication. And another important thing, like when it comes to data, is ability to trace. So if be in a position to actually support an ability to request, trace a particular information. If someone is one of your customers is requesting to delete it, be in a position to actually implement it. And this is where we see like proactively thinking about the format of the data might play a key role. So with Parque, it's very easy to write a query and identify and delete the data. So very quickly, like with the ingestion and the storage phase, you can see how we can extend the contract and start creating zones, and as well actually start thinking about what kind of obfuscation you need. So it need not be complex on day one when you start, but think about what is the minimum that you would need.
Okay, so now the data has come to storage. We think time to think about processing of the data. So before I go further, you'll see some little icons on the top right corner. That is basically, you can see which phase we are into. And you can also see there are second little icons which will come in some of the screens, which is basically the three principles. Which principle are we talking about? Okay, so when we talk about data processing, there in a typical infrastructure, we have orchestration, compute, and storage. So when we talk about orchestration in compute, it should be in their own subnet, networking, and all those things. These are default. But then when we specifically talk about compute, make sure if the compute is accessing sensitive data, we should follow the zoning, networking, or network segregation, which Kiru already covered. Now, when orchestration talks to compute for transformation of the data, then it should only be through managed identity or role-based access. We should avoid using provisioning of tokens, because that way, if you are using tokens, you are relying on someone else to make sure that tokens are secure. And there could be some situations where you have to, maybe your infrastructure is not supportive of managed identity or role-based access, then have life cycles associated with those tokens. When compute talks to storage, it should be through private endpoints. Encryption should be encryption at rest or in transit by default. And again, that access between compute to storage to read, write data, it should only be through managed identity or role-based access. There are some of the compute services which may open up some of the public IPs or inbound ports. So make sure you check that that's not the case and those are disabled. When we are spinning up cluster to process the data, make sure you're checking who can manage the cluster, who can view and update and cancel the jobs. And that access management should only be done through the identity and access management system. And when I go into the talking about the consumption side of data, we'll talk more about how to manage this access management. When we are writing transformation, we use log management system to send our application logs, or maybe cluster diagnostic logs, which is fine. But then we should have a read action wrapper associated with these logs so that we don't end up accidentally logging the sensitive data into the log management system. But this action, we should remember that this is defense in depth. First of all, there should not be a case that where we end up logging, or we should not log any sensitive data in log management system. Apart from this, when we have a log management system, use that to send your network traffic flow or data access logs to further strengthen your security. Now, as we are talking about transformations or processing of the data, it has two aspects, code and data. Now, when we talk about code, we use a lot of open source these days, which is awesome. But then along with this, we also get a lot of vulnerabilities. So make sure that you have automatic scanning in your pipelines, and all the minor version upgrades should be automatically done, and have plans for all the major version upgrades. So that is code. But talking about the data itself, there is a misconception that we need all real data for testing our transformations. And if we are using real data for transformation, a lot of real data for transformation, we are opening it for breaches and vulnerabilities. So what can we do? So the grid that you see on the screen, it's nothing, but if you look at the y-axis of it, it's a code testing pyramid. And if you see the x-axis of it, it's a data testing pyramid. And when you combine it, it makes a grid. And this grid is called practical data testing grid. If you follow this grid for your testing coverage of the transformations or the data processing, you will be able to manage entire testing with all the synthetic or mock data. But there may be certain cases in some organization where they would want to use for global and E2E tests, they may want to use real data. So what can we do in that case? So if you have a test region where you are cloning your production data, make sure you use proper obfuscation techniques, which were shared by Kiru earlier in the slides. The policies and access management for the test region should be identical to the production data, because ultimately the data in test is your production data. There should be a private link between production and test. And the monitoring of the test region should be same as that of production, because ultimately it's production data. And if something, you want to have monitoring and alerting before something goes wrong, or to identify if nothing goes wrong. Now, you can further strengthen your data pipelines by adding statistical check. So there would be certain distribution, correlations, or outliers that you would understand for your data. So you can add that in your pipelines to see if it's not as per your expectation, then have in monitoring and alerting so that you know before something goes wrong. Let's talk about data lineage. Now, normally data lineage in the data world is looked from perspective of understanding the transformation journey. But lineage is critical for security as well, because with lineage, you can understand whether the data is coming from trusted source or not, and how your sensitive data is flowing in the platform. And that if that's not as per your expectation, you can take action if you're using lineage as well. And when you're starting your lineage journey, you don't need a fancy infrastructure. You can simply use some consistent or expandable data metadata format, like one we is used in data contract. So ultimately, I mean, you can actually extend your data contract to have data lineage as well. Now, this is the summary of what we spoke about for processing of data in the data platform. But the key takeaway here is, think about the infrastructure that you are using in the processing. Think about the code you're using in the processing, and how your infrastructure and code are interacting with your data. And that's where your vulnerabilities are. And then use the classification to identify and then implement the most non-negotiable aspects of the data security. Now, we spoke about processing. Now let's talk about consumption. Now, there can be multiple ways of consuming data from a data platform, like APIs, or maybe dashboards, or some sort of workspaces, which is notebooks and all those things. But we've seen that workspaces are the most common ones. So we'll look at that example, how access management for workspace should be done. So if you see on this picture, we have Office Network, we have Data Workspace, and we have data. So when Office Network talks to Data Workspace, yes, there should be VPC pairing. Workspace talks to data, it should be private endpoints and only limited access. Now, let's take an example of two teams who wants to access data in the workspace, risk team and marketing team. Now, risk team is allowed to have access to all the sensitive data, all the raw data. So we'll write privileges for them. And marketing team is only allowed to access encrypted data. It can't access sensitive data. So we'll write privileges for them as well. That's fine. But now there's a problem with this. See, if you start onboarding multiple teams, a lot of teams in your organization, you'll have to keep writing privileges for them, which can again cause a lot of security issues or due to security management headache. So what can we do? We can use our classification. So what we can do is we can say, create two access roles, finance sensitive and finance default, and add all those teams who have access, allowed to have access to finance sensitive under that. And similarly for finance default as well. But there is a problem with this. Now, we are managing these two teams inside the workspace. What if something changes at the organization level? Then somebody would have to manually sync in those changes in the workspace. That again leaves chances for security vulnerabilities. So what can we do? So instead of managing those teams inside the workspace, we take them out and manage it in the identity, org level identity and access management system. And this is called system of cross identity management, which will automatically sync those roles. We call them functional roles, which are outside, into the workspace without somebody needing to manually sync them up. And then if anyone wants to log in, they can use single sign-ons with MFA to log in into the data workspace. This gives us simplified and deterministic access. The other things we should remember to further strengthen our access management is have limits on batch downloads. You can further strengthen it by adding risk and identity protection features like alerting on account sign-in behavior in case of deviations. Now, to summarize the consumption, you can look at this picture, but the key takeaway here is how you can simplify your consumption or access management by using classification so that it's simple to manage and it is deterministic.
So I guess by now, like you would have an idea that to build a data platform secure, like you need to do multiple things across the lifecycle in different stages. And you might have also noticed that when the data is more towards the sensitive side, there are a lot of controls to prevent any breach. But as well, even for data which is public and private within your organization, still there are a lot of detective controls for you to understand what's happening with the data. So, and also another thing to keep in mind that in case of an incident, obviously you'll have a plan to have a corrective action immediately, but as well take lessons from those corrective actions and see how that could be translated into a preventive action so that you have that degree of confidence to monitor and prevent it from next time. So before we finish, this is like 30 minutes. And what you saw in this talk, like I'm not expecting everyone to remember every single thing, but rather we hope this would kind of create an awareness of how you can make it secure by building defense in multiple layers. I'm sure like all of you would agree with me on this one. And also we want to kind of leave you with some of our guiding principles, like which you have to keep in back of your mind when you're thinking about building your platform. So the first one around make sure it's not a competition between democratization and the data security, but it is more about finding a balance between understanding the data and how to make it easy to use, but at the same time have those control measures in place. And as well, like we said, make sure the policies are simple and clear. So a team would appreciate if you immediately tell them why they can't have access, which could be derived from the contract, rather than waiting for a few weeks to give them an answer. And as well, the other thing we see is that, like particularly in the world of data platform, there might be a bit of a push towards building your very first data product, but use your security and classification as an input to determine what could be that very first product. So the very first product need not actually be everything with the sensitive data, but rather you may be able to build a proof of concept with private data to start with. And as well, like kind of understand what's negotiable, what's non-negotiable. And again, there's an aspect of doing certain things manually and then coming back to it and automating it. And make sure you kind of keep evolving, because it is just not about building it once and forgetting about it. So you might be using SaaS providers, you might be using cloud players, even they evolve like over time. So kind of make sure you leverage what's changing in the ecosystem as well. The other thing to remember is a kind of shared responsibility. So you would have noticed that the multiple teams are involved across the platform team itself, the data owners, the data consumers. So making it secure is a shared responsibility of multiple teams. And as well, be mindful of when you're using cloud providers, like what is their responsibility and what lies within your boundary based on how you design your platform. And again, like infrastructure is as vulnerable as your code. So drive it through code, have the same levels of controls around your infrastructure as well. And again, like kind of think about automation. So some of these things, like you'll get that ability to scale and you'll get that deterministic access if you kind of start automating it. And you would already have the ability, capability within your organization to automate it. So it's just about knowing what must be done today and what could actually wait to a later point in time. And we hope like this would give you an idea of practically what does it take to build a secure data platform. And as well, like we are seeing a lot of organizations like where they are doing it more consciously, just not because there's a regulatory requirement, but also organizations want to kind of build that trust with their consumers. So kind of you could play a key role if you're part of the platform team. More than happy to take any questions on Slack.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your time.
Wow. I have to say that presented so much information in such a short time. I think that was a flood. That was incredible. And I think for the audience who are watching, they can probably only imagine how comforting it is to have two people like this on your team for when your clients come up with really complex things. Now, I'm going to put to you the toughest question that we've had in, and I know it's exactly the sort of question my team working on my project at a well-known Australian retailer would ask you. So a lot of what you talked about would be great if you were building from scratch, if you were building new. But what are your recommendations and principles if the platform's already been built and you don't have the luxury of being there to architect it? Where do you start? All those wonderful principles you've talked about, but legacy.
I think like kind of a lot of these, concepts that we spoke about could be implemented even within an existing platform. Of course, there are certain things like creating a segregation at the network level, changing your infrastructure might be tricky to do as a bolt-on on your existing platform, but pretty much everything else around managing your access and thinking about creating a data contract and obfuscation, and a lot of those things could be easily implemented even with an existing platform.
Yeah, and adding to what Kido mentioned, I think we do enhance our system. So I would think it as a next enhancement that we are building on our platform and use the principles that we have shared and just gradually, enhance your security.
Okay. One more question. So we have a little bit of time, and you were so wonderfully on time. I'm going to learn a lot from you, and you're disciplined and clearly well practiced. The data testing grid, with data in one direction and code in the other, you went quite quickly through that, but it seems a really important point. What would you add if we've got a couple of extra minutes back on slide 32? What would you add to that slide to encourage people to tackle that problem?
Yeah, so that we have a great article. So our AI principal and director, Dave Coles, wrote an article, and he's the one who introduced the practical data testing grid. So I would we would share that article with everyone, and it explains you what point testing, sample testing, or global testing is, so that you can understand in depth. But we need a complete session to go through it. So to begin with, I think that article is a good point to start with. And if anyone has any question, they can reach out to us anytime.
Okay, excellent. And that's the advantage of the Slack channel, which people can go and have a look. You'll hang around there after your talk. It is about to be lunchtime. And look, thank you so much. You put so much into preparing for that. Very lucky clients who get to benefit from you working on their work on a daily basis, because keeping them at the cutting edge. And I hope everyone enjoyed your talk today.